Welcome to Boring Pastimes, where we wander slowly through forgotten corners of history. Tonight, we open the quiet gates of Ottoman gardens, where fountains once murmured, cypress trees cast their shadows, and silent gardeners bent to their work. Nothing here is hurried, nothing is dramatic, just the long patience of soil, water, and human care. Story 1. Echoes by the Fire, Yoruba. Storytellers and the quiet work of memory. When the sun dropped below the horizon in a Yoruba town 2 centuries ago, life did not simply end with the day's work. Instead, the evening carried its own rhythm, slower than the hours of farming or trading, but no less important. Around courtyards and hearths, where smoke from cooking fires lingered and children had eaten their evening meals, a different kind of work began, the work of memory. You might picture yourself seated on a low wooden stool, the earth still warm beneath your feet, while families gather in a wide circle. In the center sits the elder, or sometimes a younger apprentice storyteller, ready to weave together the threads of past, present, and future. The Yoruba word for a storyteller is akiv, one who composes or recounts stories. Unlike written chronicles, which fix events to the page, these tellers carried their histories in the shifting patterns of words. Some stories recounted the deeds of ancestors. Others explained why certain customs were observed. Still others spoke of gods and spirits, or simply entertained with humor and wit. The circle of listeners included every generation: grandparents nodding along, parents leaning against pillars, children half drowsy but wide-eyed at the same time. To understand how these evenings unfolded, it helps to slow down and look at the small details: the crackle of palm kernel shells on the fire, the way shadows stretched across mud-plastered walls, the rhythm of insects buzzing in the dark. These were not mere background noises. They were the conditions in which memory survived. Without microphones or pages, stories relied on silence, attention, and patience. A tale might last the better part of an hour, broken into sections with pauses for songs, chants, or calandresponse exchanges between the teller and the audience. Consider the role of repetition. A proverb might appear once, twice, even 3 times within a story. This was not accidental. Repetition carved grooves in the mind, ensuring that the words could be recalled later. If you forgot a line of a story, you were not only forgetting entertainment, you were neglecting a form of history, one that tied your community together. Thus, children were encouraged to learn proverbs early, repeating them during games or chores, long before they understood the full meaning. The content of these tales often surprised outsiders. Many did not focus on kings, warriors, or great battles, but on small matters: why the tortoise's shell is cracked, why the yam needs to be cooked, why the river does not flow backward. They dealt with order, mischief, consequences, and above all, the moral weight of daily decisions. You may think of them as minor, even boring. Yet for the Yoruba, they carried immense weight. They guided how one greeted a neighbor, how one respected an elder, how one handled disputes. Evening storytelling also had a rhythm that paralleled the agricultural calendar. During planting or harvest, people were too weary for long tales, so shorter proverbs or riddles sufficed. But in the dry season, when evenings stretched without rain and fields required less work, stories lengthened. A storyteller might begin just after supper and continue until the moon reached its peak, Some nights, children drifted into sleep before the tale ended, learning the rhythm of history not only through listening but also through dreaming. One curious element of Yoruba oral tradition was the expectation of audience participation. You could not sit passively, arms folded, and merely observe. The teller might pause and wait for the crowd to chant a response. They might introduce a song, requiring the group to sing the chorus in unison. In this way, the story was never owned by one person alone, it was co-created. If you imagine yourself in that circle, you would feel both responsibility and delight. Your voice, however small, helped keep the story alive. The Yoruba also held that stories had proper times and places. Some were meant for the courtyard, where anyone might listen. Others were restricted to initiation rites or ritual gatherings. Telling a sacred story casually at the wrong time could invite misfortune. Thus, storytellers were not merely entertainers. They were custodians of boundaries. They knew which tale suited a child, which one belonged to the moonlit night, and which belonged only to the inner circle of elders. Over generations, storytellers served as living archives. They remembered genealogies, tracing descent lines back through dozens of names, linking present families to distant ancestors. They recalled the founding of towns, the migrations of clans, the agreements between rulers and priests. Unlike written treaties, these were spoken records, vulnerable to forgetting, but also alive, adaptable, and resilient. A storyteller might adjust details for a new audience, but the core truths remained: who you were, where you came from, and how you should live. In this sense, the hum of night in a Yoruba town was not simply quiet leisure. It was a classroom, a courtroom, a theater, and a council meeting all at once. Imagine the firelight flickering on the face of an elder as they recounted how trickster Tortoise tried to cheat his neighbors, only to fall into a pit. Children giggled, but elders nodded knowingly. The moral lesson was not hidden. It was offered plainly, again and again. Deceit leads to downfall. Patience leads to respect. But what happens to memory when it depends entirely on breath and voice? What is lost in the pauses, in the silences, in the failures of recall? And how did these fragile threads of speech survive wars, droughts, migrations, and the arrival of outsiders with their books and pens? That is where we will continue in the next section by following not only the words of the storytellers, but also the apprentices, the note-takers, and the later historians who tried to capture what might otherwise vanish. To imagine the Yoruba storyteller only as a solitary figure in the firelight is to miss the larger system that sustained them. The work of memory did not belong to one elder alone. It was passed, step by step, from one generation to the next. Apprenticeship formed the hidden backbone of oral tradition. Without it, the fragile chain of memory would break within a single lifetime. A young apprentice often began by listening, not speaking. Their place in the circle was close to the elder, near enough to hear every word, to observe the rhythm of pauses, and to notice when the audience laughed or gasped. At first, the apprentice might be asked only to recite a proverb or to lead a chorus. Later, they might try retelling a short tale to children in the afternoon, when mistakes could be forgiven. Gradually, the burden grew heavier. To be trusted with a full story meant you carried the weight of the community's memory in your chest. The Yoruba held that the mouth was not merely for eating or casual chatter. It was an instrument of inheritance. The proverb, "To nu niel," the mouth is the house of the unknown, reminds us that words could conceal secrets, preserve wisdom, or betray trust. For an apprentice, discipline of speech was as important as memory. A careless slip might reveal a story reserved for ritual use. To speak too quickly, without rhythm, was seen as a kind of disrespect to both the audience and the ancestors. Elders kept close watch. They corrected mistakes gently but firmly, stopping a story midway to supply the proper line, or asking the apprentice to repeat a proverb until the cadence matched tradition. Unlike written texts, where a single error might mar the page, oral learning embraced repetition as correction. The very act of failing and trying again reinforced the memory more deeply. But even with this system of careful training, fragility remained. One drought, one epidemic, one war could scatter communities and leave gaps in memory. Some stories vanished, carried away with those who died suddenly. Others became distorted, their details shifting as refugees mingled with new neighbors. What remained constant was the effort, the repeated gathering, the nightly retelling, the quiet persistence of apprentices who held on to fragments until stability returned. This fragility is why the arrival of writing among the Yoruba in the 19th century was both a blessing and a disruption. Missionaries, traders, and scholars began to record oral stories, not always with full understanding, but with an eagerness to preserve. To write down a folk tale or a genealogy was to freeze it in a way that oral tradition never did. For some, this felt like a safeguard. For others, it stripped the story of its living breath. Imagine an elder watching as a missionary scribbled notes in a leather-bound book while a tale unfolded. The elder's words, meant to rise and fall with song and gesture, were reduced to lines of ink, without tone, without audience response, without the pauses for laughter. How could the story live? And yet, without such writing, how many stories would have been lost entirely? Apprenticeship itself began to shift under these pressures. Some apprentices learned not only the old art of recitation, but also the new skill of reading and writing. They became mediators between two worlds, trying to carry the rhythm of the spoken word into the permanence of the written page. This balancing act was not easy. To translate a Yoruba proverb into English or French often meant losing layers of meaning. A word that carried both humor and warning might appear flat in translation. Still, the attempt mattered, for it gave future generations at least a glimpse of the past. Within Yoruba towns, not every apprentice became a great storyteller. Some fell away, drawn to other trades or to the allure of urban life. Others remained, quietly carrying the less glamorous parts of the tradition, remembering genealogies, recording land agreements, or ensuring ritual stories were told at the right festivals. These less dramatic roles kept communities tied to their roots. You might think of them as the accountants of memory, less visible than the performers, but equally essential. What is striking about this system is how much patience it required. No apprentice could rush the process. A single tale might take years to learn in full, not because of length alone, but because of timing. Certain stories could only be told at particular festivals or seasons. An apprentice might wait months, before hearing a line repeated. This enforced waiting meant that the rhythm of learning matched the rhythm of community life itself. The calendar, the harvest, the rituals all became part of the syllabus of oral education. Yet fragility persisted. Colonial wars, slave raids, and forced migrations fractured families and scattered apprentices. Many who might have become master storytellers were taken away, leaving only fragments behind. Some communities compensated by shortening tales, reducing genealogies to a handful of remembered names, or replacing elaborate chants with simpler versions. In these adjustments, we see resilience and insistence on keeping something alive, even if it had to be pared down. The Yoruba concept of a custom, tradition reminds us that culture was not a static archive but a living practice. Apprenticeship was not about preserving every detail unchanged. It was about carrying forward the essence, even if form shifted. A proverb might acquire new words, a tale might adjust to new listeners, but the moral backbone endured. So, when you sit in that circle of listeners, you are not merely hearing one elder. You are hearing the echoes of apprentices before them, some long gone, some forgotten, but all woven into the rhythm of the story. Each word is both fragile because it depends on memory and resilient because memory insists on surviving. And yet, the question lingers. When a culture built on voice encounters the permanence of ink, what is gained and what is quietly lost in the process? If you picture that Yoruba courtyard, again the circle of stools, the glow of embers, the slow unfolding of tales, it might seem far removed from the present. Yet storytelling, though reshaped by time, never truly left. It adapted, stretched, and folded itself into new forms, carrying fragments of the old rhythm into the modern world. By the late 19th and early 20th centuries, Yoruba lands were enmeshed in colonial administration, Christian missions, and expanding towns. Written archives, multiplied schools, taught children to read and write in both Yoruba and English, and presses began to print books and newspapers. At first glance, the oral tradition appeared threatened, pushed aside by literacy. But in practice, the firelight stories did not vanish. They simply changed their stage. Public gatherings, once confined to courtyards, found new life in festivals. Annual events, such as Odin Jail Hunters Festivals or masquerade processions, became sites where storytelling merged with performance. Masked dancers embodied spirits, while narrators explained their origins through tales, chants, and proverbs. Here, the storyteller's role blurred with that of priest, singer, and actor. The circle of listeners expanded beyond the household into the whole town. In smaller spaces, too, oral tradition persisted. Families continued to recount folktales to children before bed, sometimes shortened, sometimes modernized. The trickster tortoise, who once schemed against his neighbors, might now appear in a version warning children about crossing busy streets or trusting strangers. Proverbs shifted as well. An older saying about yam barns and harvest might be updated for city life, referencing coins, wages, or even bicycles. The form was flexible. The moral backbone remained. During the 20th century, Yoruba writers such as Dio Faganwa began weaving folk tales into novels, bringing oral rhythms onto the page. His stories carried elements of chant, repetition, and proverb, preserving the musical quality of speech even in print. Later, musicians did the same. Drummers echoed the tonal patterns of Yoruba words, and singers embedded proverbs within songs. What began by the firelight now reached radios, stages, and records. The voice carried further, even as its medium shifted. Still, a paradox lingered. Written and recorded forms preserved stories against forgetting, yet they could also flatten them. A printed folktale in a schoolbook lost the responsive chorus of children. A radio broadcast reached thousands but lacked the intimacy of eye contact between teller and listener. Something essential, the shared silence, the mutual shaping of a tale, was harder to capture. The Yoruba world has lived with this paradox for over a century. Consider the talking drum, dwindwin, long used to mimic speech. Even when radio spread across West Africa, drummers still played messages across villages. A drumbeat could announce a wedding, warn of danger, or praise a chief. In this way, drum and word overlapped. Each preserved the old sense that language was not simply communication, but rhythm, tone, and community. Oral storytelling, whether by elder or by drum, still framed how memory moved. In the 21st century, Yoruba storytelling continues to survive in unexpected places. Folk tales appear in children's books, but also on YouTube channels where narrators record themselves retelling ancestral stories. Festivals still draw crowds, but so do podcasts and films that echo the cadence of proverbs. In Lagos, you might find a spoken word poet blending English with Yoruba, reciting verses that sound half like rap, half like a grandmother's story by the fire. The persistence of this tradition raises questions. Why do people continue to tell stories long after writing and digital technology could replace them? Perhaps because stories are not simply data. They are experiences shaped in real time by voice, gesture, and audience. A proverb written on a page is information. A proverb spoken aloud, in rhythm, becomes wisdom shared. In every era, the apprentice system, though altered, remains. Today's apprentices may not sit at the feet of elders in the same way, but they learn through recordings, through participation in festivals, or through formal education in Yoruba literature. They still carry forward fragments, sometimes imperfectly, sometimes creatively. The work of memory remains ongoing. To sit in a Yoruba circle of listeners, whether in 1800 or 2023, is to feel the same patience at work. The stories may be shorter now, the fire replaced by electric light, but the moral thread endures. Honesty matters. Respect for elders matters. Community matters. Even when stripped of their ritual weight. These lessons shape how people greet one another, how disputes are settled, how laughter is shared. Perhaps the most striking element of Yoruba storytelling is its refusal to disappear. It has bent, stretched, migrated, and modernized, but it has not broken. When we listen closely, whether to a child's bedtime story or to a proverb dropped casually in conversation, we still hear the echoes of the firelight circles. And so, the question remains, in a future where artificial intelligence and digital archives promise to store every word forever, will the living breath of storytelling, its pauses, its repetitions, its shared silences still matter as much as it once did under the night sky? Story 2. Lanterns and Bargains. The Yoruba Night Markets of the 18th century. Section 1. The market awakens at dusk. 1,500 to 2,000 words. Target when daylight slipped behind the western horizon in an 18th century Yoruba town. The day's work did not end. Instead, another cycle of activity began, one that thrived, not in sunlight, but under the softer glow of oil lamps, moonlight, and the low flames of torches. These were the night markets, spaces where trade, gossip, and quiet negotiations unfolded. While the rest of the world seemed to sleep, picture yourself walking toward one of these markets. The path is worn from countless feet, its surface dusty in the dry season, muddy during rains. The air cools after the heat of day, carrying with it the smell of roasted maize and smoked fish. As you approach, you begin to hear it, a steady murmur of voices, punctuated by laughter, bargaining, and the occasional clang of metal tools. There is no shouting. Markets at night did not need the volume of daytime trade. Instead, business was conducted at a lower register, with careful words and patient haggling. Lanterns hung from poles or balanced on makeshift stands. Their light was uneven, throwing shadows that stretched and danced across stalls. Merchants arranged their goods on mats or wooden tables, yams stacked in neat piles, baskets of peppers glowing red even in the dim light, strips of dried meat, jars of palm oil, and bundles of cloth folded precisely. The dull gleam of cowrie shells, the standard currency of the time, flashed as they changed hands, poured from gourds or tied up in strings. Unlike daytime markets, night markets carried a different rhythm. Farmers often worked their fields during the day and only had evenings free to sell produce. Women, who dominated much of Yoruba trade, used night hours to bring cooked food, small luxuries, and household necessities. These hours allowed them to balance domestic responsibilities with economic activity. For some, the night market was not only about profit, but about visibility. Here, even small traders could find a place among the bustle. The market was not merely economic, it was social. Conversations flowed alongside bargaining. Neighbors exchanged greetings. Young men lingered to impress women, and children darted between stalls with coins in hand, eager to buy roasted groundnuts or palm wine diluted with water. A proverb often recited in such spaces was "J ni ebi rencurindo." The market is the place of encounters. Indeed, one might come for yams, but leave with a marriage proposal, news of distant relatives, or rumors of political shifts in neighboring towns. Silence had its role too. Some buyers lingered at stalls, running their hands across cloth, weighing yams in their palms, or inspecting gourds of oil by the lantern's flicker. Bargains were struck, not always by words, but by gestures, a raised eyebrow, a small nod, the deliberate placing of cowries on the mat. In this way, trade became a kind of unspoken dialogue. The arrangement of markets reflected both order and improvisation. Larger towns designated open squares for regular markets, often near shrines or palace courtyards. Smaller villages used wider paths or open clearings. A market might rise and fall with the day, its stalls carried in baskets and reassembled each evening. Some markets specialized fish near rivers, cloth in weaving towns, iron tools in blacksmith centers, while others mixed everything together, producing a scene of quiet abundance. You might imagine the scents as clearly as the sights. Roasting maize mixed with the tang of fermented locust bean paste, smoked fish with freshly cut palm fronds. the earthy smell of damp soil underfoot. These were not luxuries to most participants. They were the sense of necessity. The market kept households supplied, kitchens busy, and communities fed. Yet the night also brought its risks. Lantern flames were fragile, and sudden gusts of wind might plunge sections of the market into darkness. Theft, though less common in the close-knit atmosphere of Yoruba towns, was still possible. Traders kept careful watch over goods, sometimes enlisting children or apprentices to guard piles of produce. Market elders or guards circulated, ensuring disputes did not grow into quarrels. Rules of conduct, unwritten but firmly understood, guided behavior. Insults or cheating could result in exclusion, a serious punishment in a community where trade was survival. Markets also connected towns to broader trade networks. Cowries, imported through coastal routes, passed hand to hand in inland markets. Salt from distant regions appeared beside local peppers. Cloth dyed indigo might come from a weaving town days away, while beads and brass traveled from even farther. The night market, though ordinary in appearance, was a quiet intersection of global flows. To buy a pot of palm oil was not only to engage in local exchange, but to touch a chain that stretched to coastal ports and beyond. For the Yoruba, the market also carried spiritual weight. Many towns honored J, the spirit of the marketplace, believed to oversee fairness and prosperity. Shrines sometimes stood near market entrances, and offerings of kola, nuts, or palm wine were made to ensure smooth trade. Market women, who often wielded significant authority, invoked these spirits when disputes arose, reminding all that commerce was bound not only by profit, but by morality and custom. And so, as you stand in that 18th century market, lantern light flickering on cowries and yams, you sense that the night is alive with more than commerce. It is alive with memory, with order, with the shared trust of a community that knows survival depends on cooperation as much as competition. But one question lingers as you listen to the murmur of voices and watch goods exchange hands. What happened when night markets grew too crowded, when trade spilled beyond the town square, or when rival towns competed for the same flows of goods? Did this quiet rhythm of lanterns and bargains always hold, or did it sometimes give way to conflict and reorganization? Every Yoruba market, whether in daylight or by lantern flame, carried with it not just the hum of trade, but also the quiet presence of authority. Without rules, the piles of peppers, yams, and palm oil could have become scenes of chaos. Yet most Yoruba markets, even those bustling at night, moved with a remarkable orderliness. The secret to this calm was found in the hands of women traders, organizers, and enforcers of custom. In many Yoruba towns, the market was considered the domain of women. Not only did they dominate the stalls, they also governed how goods were sold, how disputes were settled, and how order was maintained. At the head stood the wild J, literally, the mother of the market. This figure, usually a senior and respected woman, balanced economic sense with moral authority. She was not a ruler in the same sense as a king Oba, yet her voice carried immense weight in everyday life. The wild J acted as both judge and mediator. When disputes broke out, perhaps a buyer accused a seller of cheating on measures of palm oil, or two women quarreled over who had the right to a prime spot, she stepped in. Her authority was respected because it was rooted not in military power but in trust, long years of trading, and an ability to uphold fairness. Traders deferred to her decisions, knowing that exclusion from the market was a punishment no one could afford. Beneath the YLJ, other women acted as assistants, organizing stalls, inspecting goods, and ensuring that cowries used in exchange were not counterfeit. These small details mattered. A string of cowries could be cut and resewn to make it look like more shells than it contained. Weights for measuring might be tampered with. Market overseers kept sharp eyes on these details, preserving a fragile balance of trust. The rhythm of Yoruba markets was also tied to calendars. Some markets were held every 4 days, others every 8, depending on local custom. The night markets slotted themselves into this rhythm, ensuring they did not clash with larger daytime gatherings. In this way, trade circulated in waves, allowing farmers and traders to move from one town to another, following the sequence of markets across the region. This system required coordination, and the YLJ often played a role in negotiating with neighboring towns to avoid conflict. Politics quietly flowed through these spaces. Kings and chiefs relied on markets for revenue. Taxes or small levies were often collected from traders, sometimes in the form of goods, sometimes in cowries. These contributions funded palaces, festivals, or military needs. Yet the collection could not be done harshly, for traders might simply leave to another town's market. Thus, rulers had to cooperate with market leaders, striking a balance between authority and consent. Women, through their economic dominance, gained a measure of influence that extended beyond the stalls. The YLJ could advise kings, petition for lower taxes, or rally traders in times of crisis. This quiet political power challenges the assumption that pre-colonial authority was always melded. In truth, Yoruba governance had many layers, and the market offered one of the most visible spaces for women's leadership. Night markets, in particular, provided opportunities for those with fewer resources. A small trader, unable to compete with the grandeur of daytime stalls, might find a niche at night, selling roasted maize, bean cakes, or palm wine by lantern light. The dimness itself made the market more democratic. Goods did not shine with the brilliance they did under the sun. Instead, trade relied more on conversation, trust, and small gestures. For those starting out, it was a way into commerce. The presence of apprentices was also notable. Children often accompanied mothers or aunts, learning how to count cowries, measure oil, or arrange produce attractively. This training was not formal but constant. A girl who sold roasted plantains at night would, in time, learn the larger calculations of cloth and yam sales. By adulthood, she might become a significant trader herself. Apprenticeship in the market was as crucial as apprenticeship in the crafts or oral storytelling. It was how memory of trade survived. Markets also reflected hierarchy. Certain stalls were highly prized. Entrances, corners, near shrines, or places close to torchlight. Securing such a spot required negotiation or the favor of the YLJ, yet fairness was emphasized. If someone abused their position, the market could turn against them, boycotting their goods or refusing to buy. The social fabric ensured that arrogance or dishonesty rarely lasted long. Despite the calm, the markets were not free from wider tensions. Rival towns sometimes tried to outdo one another by attracting more traders, lowering taxes, or boasting better security. In times of political strife, wars between Yoruba city-states, raids, or droughts, markets became fragile. Trade routes could be cut, salt or cloth might become scarce, and prices would fluctuate. A night market that once hummed with balance could quickly become anxious, with whispers of shortages or news from afar. And yet, even in these periods, markets rarely vanished altogether. People needed to eat, to clothe themselves, to celebrate marriages or burials. The scale might shrink, the goods might shift, but the lanterns were still lit. This resilience reflects how deeply markets were woven into Yoruba life. They were not optional extras, they were the pulse of survival. What makes this system fascinating is its mixture of fragility and strength. A market could be disrupted by political change, yet the institution itself endured, reshaping around new circumstances. Women's authority, the rhythm of calendars, the trust of exchange all combined to preserve continuity. So, as you wander through the lantern-lit stalls in your imagination, hearing the measured bargaining and watching the patient order enforced by the wild jay and her helpers, you might ask yourself, what happened when these markets collided with the new economic systems brought by Europeans? With coins replacing cowries and imported goods flooding the stalls, could the quiet rhythm of Yoruba night trade survive such disruptions unchanged? By the dawn of the 19th century, Yoruba markets, so carefully balanced under the glow of lanterns, were drawn into forces larger than themselves. The Atlantic trade, colonial incursions, missionary schools, and the arrival of imported goods all pressed against the older systems. The question was not whether markets would survive, but how they would bend. Cowries. For centuries, the steady currency of Yoruba exchange faced competition from European coins. Traders carried gourds full of shells, counted in strings of 40 or measured in heaps. A woman selling yams knew instinctively how many shells equaled a fair trade. But coins were foreign, heavy, metallic, stamped with strange portraits. At first, many resisted, preferring the shells whose value was fixed by long familiarity. Yet cowries were tied to oceanic supply, arriving through coastal trade. When shipments faltered or demand shifted, scarcity followed. Gradually, coins found their way into night markets, used alongside cowries in a hybrid system. This transition was not immediate or smooth. Bargains became complicated. Was a pile of peppers worth 100 cowries, or should one accept a British penny instead? Some traders demanded conversion into shells before completing a deal. Others, more eager to adapt, embraced coins as easier to carry and count. Apprentices now learned not only how to tie strings of cowries, but also how to recognize genuine coins from forgeries. Markets became schools of arithmetic as well as exchange. New goods also arrived. Cloth woven locally yuzo oak dyed indigo faced rivals in the form of European textiles, cheaper and brightly colored. Some buyers preferred these novelties, while others clung to the prestige of traditional fabric. Iron pots, glass beads, and liquor altered what stalls displayed. Lanterns flickered now on imported goods, stacked beside yams and peppers. The market expanded in range, but also in complexity, as traders had to decide which goods to risk investing in. colonial authorities, recognizing the market's central role, began to impose taxes more systematically. Where once levies had been negotiated informally through the wild jay, now officials sought to standardize collections. This shift threatened the authority of market women, who had long mediated between rulers and traders. Some resisted, using their networks to protest excessive taxation. In certain towns, women staged collective boycotts, refusing to bring goods until conditions improved. These acts of quiet defiance revealed how markets were not only economic spaces but also political battlegrounds. Despite these tensions, the night markets endured. Their advantages remained: cooler air for trade, convenience for farmers who labored in the daytime, and a social rhythm that writing and coins could not erase. By lantern light, negotiations still relied on careful words, small gestures, and mutual trust. Even with coins jingling alongside cowries, the essence of exchange remained personal. Yet not all changes were external. The growth of urban centers within Yorubaland shifted how markets functioned. In towns like Ibadan or Lagos, markets swelled far beyond the intimate scale of village gatherings. Night markets stretched into crowded streets, stalls multiplied, and the murmur of voices rose into a hum of thousands. Here, anonymity replaced the familiarity of small towns. Buyers and sellers no longer always knew each other, and trust became a more fragile thread. Rules and oversight adapted, but the tone was different, more hurried, less personal, more tied to the demands of an expanding economy. Still, in quieter towns and villages, the older patterns lingered. Lanterns illuminated small clusters of stalls. Neighbors bargained with familiarity. Apprentices learned by watching elders. In such places, the market was less a spectacle than a steady rhythm of survival. The endurance of Yoruba night markets, even through disruption, lies in their dual nature. They were both fragile and flexible. Fragile because currency shifts, taxes, or wars could unsettle them. Flexible because traders, especially women, found ways to adapt, combining cowries with coins, local cloth with imported fabric, small bargains with new forms of accounting. If you pause to imagine standing once again in the middle of such a market, you might feel this blend of continuity and change. The sense of smoked fish and roasted maize remain. The glow of lanterns still softens the night, but alongside gourds of palm oil now lie glass bottles, and next to baskets of peppers are imported textiles. The market holds both past and future, both memory and adaptation, and so a question lingers for reflection. If markets have always adapted whether to coins or imported goods, what might they look like in another century? Will lantern-lit bargaining still matter in a world of digital trade? Or does the essence of a market, the human meeting, the murmur of negotiation, resist replacement altogether? Story 3. The hum of drums, talking drums, and the language of rhythm. If you stand before a Yoruba talking drum or gangan, you might at first see only wood and leather. A hollowed piece of hardwood forms the shell, narrow in the middle, wide at both ends, giving the drum its hourglass shape. Stretched across each end is animal skin, often goat or antelope, carefully dried, softened, and tied with cords. These cords run along the sides of the drum, binding one head to the other. It is through these cords, tightened or loosened by the drummer's arm, that the drum speaks. The making of such a drum was neither quick nor casual. Skilled carvers selected wood not only for strength but also for resonance. Too thick, and the drum would sound dull. Too thin, and it might crack under tension. Hunters contributed hides, which tanners treated with ash, water, and oil before stretching them into shape. The process could take weeks. A completed drum was more than a tooled, was an object of care, bound up with rituals of blessing. Before its first use, sacrifices might be offered, prayers whispered, ensuring the drum's voice carried not only sound but power. When held under the arm, the drum came alive. The player tucked it against the ribs, squeezing the cords with the upper arm while striking the head with a curved stick. Each squeeze raised the pitch, each release lowered it. In this way, the drum could mimic the tonal language of Yoruba speech. Unlike drums that only mark rhythm, the talking drum carried meaning. Travelers often described their first encounters with this sound as puzzling. To the untrained ear, it was only music. But to Yoruba audiences, the drum spoke proverbs, praised chiefs, announced visitors, even delivered warnings. A skilled drummer could carry an entire conversation across fields or from one side of a marketplace to the other. In village squares, drums accompanied storytelling. As a griot began a tale, the drummer echoed key phrases on the instrument, punctuating moments of tension or humor. Children learned early how to recognize these patterns. By adolescence, some could already identify the tones of their lineage names when played. The drum's voice extended beyond entertainment. In royal courts, drummers served as heralds. Before a chief emerged, the drums announced his titles, reciting long strings of praise names that affirmed his authority. In warfare, drummers relayed orders, their coded beats guiding movements when voices could not carry. Farmers in distant fields heard the drums, calling them to festivals or warning of danger. The drum's range and clarity made it one of the most efficient tools of communication in a world without telegraph. And yet, the talking drum was never just a machine for messages. It was deeply tied to social and spiritual life. Drummers were not casual performers. They were respected members of guilds, trained through years of apprenticeship. A young boy might begin by carrying drums for elders, watching carefully how the chords were tuned, how the stick was shaped, how the arms squeezed and released in perfect rhythm. Only after long practice would he attempt to speak through the drum, first repeating simple names, then proverbs, and eventually mastering complex praise poetry. The process of learning was humbling. A misplayed phrase could be misunderstood, or worse, offensive. Imagine a drummer announcing a chief's arrival, but accidentally striking a rhythm that resembled an insult. Such mistakes could bring shame or even punishment. Precision mattered, and so apprentices drilled endlessly, repeating tones late into the night until their arms ached. This training also instilled memory. Drummers became living archives, storing histories in rhythm. A king's genealogy, victories in battle, and acts of generosity were preserved not only in words but in drum language. Long after a ruler passed away, his praises could still be summoned by the strike of skin and wood. In this sense, drums were both instruments and libraries. Listening to the hum of drums, one could hear a community's identity. At a wedding, they offered blessings. At a funeral, they spoke grief. At markets, they attracted customers by praising sellers. At festivals, they celebrated deities. Each orir are recognized by a specific rhythm. Drummers served gods as much as humans, reminding people of the unseen world moving alongside their own. When night fell and lanterns glowed, drums often carried further than speech. Their deep resonance rolled over compounds, across rivers, into forests. To sit in the dark, hearing the steady thrum, was to feel both included in the life of the town and reminded of forces larger than oneself. And so, as you picture one of these drums' hourglass body-stretched skin, chords pressed under the arm, you may wonder, was it an instrument, a language, or something in between? Could a community ever be understood without its drums, or were the drums themselves part of its very voice? Step into the courtyard of a Yoruba palace, and before you see the king, before you hear his words, you will hear his drums. The palace itself, often a sprawling compound of mud walls and carved gates. Among the most distinctive were the drums of praise, played not for the crowd's entertainment, but as a constant reaffirmation of authority. Each Yoruba king, or Duba, carried with him a set of titles, praise names, and genealogies. These were not only recited by poets, but also beaten into rhythm by the talking drum. When the king prepared to appear in public, drummers gathered at the entrance of the palace, tightening cords, preparing skins, ensuring every tone was sharp and ready. The moment he stepped forth, the drums announced him. They called his lineage, praised his ancestors, and reminded all who listened that his authority came from history as much as from the present moment. In some towns, the drumming was so regular that people could identify the presence of the king simply by listening. Even those who could not see him felt his presence through sound. It was said that the drums spoke what courtiers could not, praising without hesitation, reminding without offense. Beyond routine appearances, the drums also played crucial roles in ceremonies. During enthronements, the new ruler's legitimacy was declared not only by chiefs, but by drummers, whose rhythms stitched the event into memory. During festivals, when kings danced in public, drums guided each step, matching his movements with tones that praised his courage or wisdom. To dance without drums would be unthinkable. For the drum was both partner and witness. But drums at court were not only celebratory, they carried political weight. Praise drumming could exalt, but it could also remind rulers of their responsibilities. A skilled drummer in weaving ancestral names might include subtle hints of past rulers' failures. Listeners caught these references, and rulers understood the drum praised, but it also advised. In this way, drummers were not mere servants, they were commentators, their rhythms shaping how power was perceived. The relationship between kings and drummers was one of mutual dependence. Drummers relied on royal patronage, receiving land, gifts, or stipends. Kings, in turn, relied on drummers to make their power audible. To silence the drums was to diminish prestige. For this reason, drummers often accompanied rulers wherever they traveled, carrying the drum as one would a herald's banner. The drum also served diplomacy. When foreign visitors approached a Yoruba palace, they were first greeted not by officials but by sound. Drummers played titles that emphasized the wealth and strength of the host king. In return, visiting delegations often brought their own musicians, setting up a dialogue of rhythm and reputation before negotiations even began. In this sense, diplomacy in Eurobaland was conducted not only with words, but with soundscapes of respect. At festivals, the political merged with the spiritual. Consider the Duandaba celebrations, where rulers appeared before their people. Drummers began at dawn, their rhythms summoning townsfolk. As the day unfolded, the drum's voice became a binding agent, uniting thousands in a shared rhythm. For a brief time, distinctions of rank softened. All heard the same sound, all danced to the same beat. Here, drumming was not only about kingship, but about community cohesion. One striking example is found in the role of the Duindwin ensemble. Unlike the single talking drum, this group included larger bass drums, smaller supporting drums, and iron bells. Together, they created layers of rhythm, mimicking not only speech, but also movement, laughter, even argument. In palace courtyards, such ensembles could sustain music for hours, their tones shifting from praise, poetry, to martial commands, from solemn announcements to playful improvisations. The court thus became a theater of sound, where politics, performance, and ritual blended seamlessly. In times of war, the talking drum's role at court extended to the battlefield. Royal orders, carried by messengers, were too slow or too easily intercepted. Instead, drummers relayed coded rhythms, a call to gather troops, a signal to advance, or a warning of retreatal could be sounded. Soldiers learned to distinguish these patterns, trusting them more than shouted commands. The court's authority thus traveled outward through drummers, ensuring obedience even at great distances. Yet, with power came risk. Because drums could transmit messages widely, their misuse could cause confusion or rebellion. Control over drumming was therefore carefully guarded. Not just anyone could strike royal praises. Training, loyalty, and authorization were required. In this way, drummers became part of the palace hierarchy, trusted but closely monitored. The blending of sacred and political authority gave drumming at court a unique character. It was at once a performance of history, a reinforcement of legitimacy, and a tool of governance. To imagine a Yoruba court without its drums would be to imagine it without its very voice. And so, when you think of kingship in Yorubaland, you may picture crowns of coral beads, thrones of carved wood, or robes of indigo and silk. But behind all these, you must also hear the steady hum of the talking drum, carrying praises and warnings, blessings and memory. But this raises a question. If the drum served both to glorify and to advise rulers, how much power did the drummers themselves hold? Were they only echoes of authority, or did they shape the very sound of kingship itself? The talking drum, though bound tightly to the palace, was never only a royal instrument. Its voice spilled outward, weaving through the fabric of daily Yoruba life. In villages, festivals, and rituals, its tones guided movement, summoned memory, and sustained connection. Even when carried far from Yorubaland, its hum endured. In villages, the drum's role was practical. Farmers in distant fields often worked until the horizon dimmed. When it was time to return for meetings or emergencies, drummers beat out specific rhythms recognized by all. The drum became a communal clock, its tones replacing the distant call of church bells in Europe. At night markets, as lanterns flickered, drummers praised traders, drawing customers with rhythmic announcements. The peppers are hot, the cloth is strong, the fish is fresh. These were not shouted by human voices, but sounded through the curving stick and taut skin of the drum. Festivals amplified this role. At annual celebrations of deities, such as Owl or Yukon, each divinity was honored with distinct rhythms. The worshippers knew these beats instinctively. When the drums struck OS thunderous patterns, dancers raised batons, mimicking lightning. When the softer tones of Yukon were played, movements became graceful, fluid, as though echoing the flow of rivers. In these moments, the drum did not merely accompany ritual, it was the ritual, a bridge between human and divine. For family events, too, the drum was indispensable. Weddings resounded with praises of both families, affirming lineages. Funerals, though somber, were marked by drums that spoke the name of the departed, ensuring that memory endured. Birth celebrations included rhythmic blessings for the infant, believed to secure good fortune. In every phase of life, the drum spoke alongside human voices, embedding private joys and griefs into the collective soundscape of the community. Drumming guilds sustained this continuity. Apprenticeship was rigorous. Boys studied under masters, traveling with them to ceremonies, learning not only rhythms but the histories encoded in them. Over time, a drummer's memory became as vast as an archive. He might know hundreds of praise, poems, genealogies, and proverbs, all translatable into tone. In this way, drummers were custodians of cultural memory. Without them, much oral tradition risked fading. But the story of the Yoruba talking drum stretches beyond Yorubaland itself. With the transatlantic slave trade, Yoruba captives carried not only memories of their homeland, but also fragments of its music. In places like Cuba, Brazil, and the Caribbean, African drums re-emerged, sometimes in secret, sometimes adapted into new forms. Colonial authorities, aware of their communicative power, often tried to suppress them. In the Americas, slaveholders feared that drums could signal rebellion, just as they had in Africa. And yet, the rhythms persisted, disguised, reshaped, and embedded in new religious traditions. In Brazil, Yoruba-derived religions like Candomblé preserved drum patterns linked to specific Orua. In Cuba, Santeria ceremonies echoed with rhythms whose lineage traced back to West Africa. Even in North America, where restrictions were harshest, the essence of the talking drum survived in handclaps, chants, and coded songs, though the hourglass drum itself was not always present. Its logic of tonal communication remained alive. This continuity speaks to resilience. Stripped of homeland, language, and kinship ties, enslaved Yoruba and their descendants found in drumming a way to rebuild connection. The drum, though small and portable, carried worlds within it. Through rhythm, memory became portable too. In the 20th century, the talking drum found new audiences. Yoruba musicians adapted it into modern ensembles, pairing it with guitars and brass. In global music festivals, drummers demonstrated its speech-like qualities, astonishing audiences unfamiliar with tonal languages. Jazz, Afrobeat, and world music absorbed its influence. Yet, even as it traveled into new genres, within Yorubaland, the drum retained its older roles, beating steadily at festivals, markets, and family ceremonies. What makes the talking drum enduring is not only its sound, but its adaptability. In villages, it was a messenger. In courts, a herald of power. In rituals, a voice of the divine. In the diaspora, a thread of survival. No single role exhausted its meaning. If you pause to imagine a Yoruba village at dusk, the picture is incomplete without its soundscape. The murmur of voices, the crackle of fires, the chirping of insects, and above these, the steady, bending tones of a drum speaking into the night. It is not only communication, not only music, but something in between. It is culture made audible. And so we end with a question. If a drum can speak carrying history, politics, and faith, does it remain an instrument? Or does it become a kind of person, a voice that outlives its maker, reminding us that sound itself can be a vessel of memory? Story 4. Silent Builders, the Stonemasons of Old Oyo. You were to walk toward Old Oyo in its height. Perhaps in the 17th century, you would see not a single walled city, but a vast sprawl. The Olafins' palace stood at the heart, a labyrinth of courtyards, halls, and shrines, surrounded by districts for chiefs, traders, and warriors. Encircling all were fortifications, walls of earth and stone, strengthened by moats and thorn fences. These defenses were not the work of kings alone, but of countless laborers, artisans, and builders whose names rarely entered chronicles, and more about endurance. Builders worked with laterite, a reddish stone common to the region, quarried in blocks and shaped with iron tools. The process was painstaking. First, men dug trenches to extract the earth, breaking it into slabs under the heat of the sun. Women often carried loads in baskets, balancing them on their heads, ferrying them to the building site. There, masons chipped, stacked, and pressed stones into alignment, binding them with mud mortar. Each wall rose slowly, course by course, a product of muscle and repetition rather than spectacle. Palaces required special attention. The Olafins' residence was not one structure, but a complex of hundreds of rooms, audience chambers, storerooms, shrines, and living quarters. Masons laid foundations that could bear the weight of timber roofs, while carpenters fitted beams and thatch. Builders coordinated with priests, who prescribed rituals at each stage, sacrifices of fowl or goats buried at corners. Libations poured into fresh earth, incantations murmured as walls rose. For the Yoruba, construction was never only technical. It was spiritual, ensuring that buildings were not just shelters, but safe vessels for human and divine presence. Even ordinary compounds reflected this blend of craft and care. Families built circular walls, enclosing central courtyards, their stones low and practical, plastered with mud to soften edges. Floors were often beaten earth, sometimes polished with cow dung for a smooth surface. Drainage channels carried away rain, reducing erosion. Nothing was extravagant, yet everything was functional, reflecting centuries of accumulated knowledge. The masons themselves lived by rhythms as steady as their craft. At dawn they gathered tools, zadz, chisels, mallets stored carefully from the day before. Apprentices carried water for mixing mortar, while masters inspected sites, gauging whether the soil was stable enough for new foundations. Work was slow, often interrupted by weather. Heavy rains softened earth, forcing pauses. Dry seasons brought cracks, demanding repairs. Builders learned patience, knowing that walls must be tested by seasons before they could be trusted. Though their work was slow, its results were transformative. Fortified towns grew in scale, giving Yoruba polities both security and prestige. Traders arriving at Oyo's gates marveled at the vastness of its walls, the order of its streets. Visitors carried stories outward, spreading Oyo's reputation as a power not only of cavalry and armies, but also of builders who shaped landscapes into ordered capitals. Masons, however, seldom stood in the spotlight. Chronicles praised kings, generals, and priests, rarely noting who laid the stones. Yet without these laborers, palaces would have been mud huts, walls would have crumbled, shrines would have lacked foundations. Their anonymity was the price of their necessity. Still, within their guilds, masons cultivated pride. Apprentices learned not only techniques, but also chancework songs that kept rhythm as they lifted stones. These songs were practical, yet they also carried coded wisdom, reminders to measure twice before cutting, to trust one's fellow worker, to honor the spirits of earth and stone. In this way, building became a tradition passed mouth to ear, hand to hand, across generations. Old Oyo's rise cannot be understood without its silent builders. Cavalry might win battles, markets might enrich the treasury, priests might sanctify rule, but walls, roads, and compounds gave these institutions space to endure. Masonry was the background of empire, rarely noticed, yet always present. So imagine yourself walking along the outer ramparts of Old Oyo at dusk. The walls glow red in the setting sun, their surfaces rough but steady. You touch the stone and feel the heat it absorbed all day, radiating back into your palm. Somewhere, masons are still at work, their hammers echoing faintly, their songs rising in unison. The empire's strength is not only in its armies or rulers, but in the calloused hands of those who built quietly, day after day. And this leads us to wonder, when history forgets the names of builders, but their walls still stand, which endures longer, the fame of kings or the stones of those who worked unseen? To build in Old Oyo was never a neutral act. Every wall, every courtyard, every shrine carried layers of meaning. Stones were not just stacked to enclose space, they were set to honor ancestors, to bind communities, and to manifest the Oliphane's authority. Masons understood their work as both practical and sacred, their labor an offering as much as a service. When masons laid foundations for the Oliphane's palace, rituals marked each stage. At the first digging, priests sprinkled water mixed with herbs, cooling the soil and invoking harmony. Chickens or goats were sacrificed, their blood seeping into the earth at the corners of new walls. This was not mere superstition. It was an affirmation that the building was entering into a relationship with the spirit of the land. Without such rituals, it was believed, the walls might not endure worse. Misfortune might befall those who lived inside. Builders also cooperated closely with diviners. Before beginning a large project, the Ifa oracle was consulted. Ifa priests threw palm nuts, interpreted verses, and advised on timing. Sometimes they recommended waiting until a specific festival passed. Other times they advised beginning work under the waxing moon. The masons followed these instructions faithfully, not because they lacked confidence in their skill, but because they recognized that stone alone could not hold a house steady without spiritual balance. The political dimension of construction was equally significant. Every major wall announced power. The Oliphanes' palace was not simply a residence, it was a statement of dominion, its scale reflecting the reach of his rule. Chiefs, in turn, constructed compounds whose size mirrored their status. A chief with higher rank was expected to maintain larger courtyards, sturdier walls, and more ornate gateways. To build modestly when one held high office risked shame. To overbuild when one's rank was low risked accusation of arrogance. Masonry thus became a visual language of hierarchy. In public works, the symbolism was even clearer. Town walls marked not only physical boundaries, but also social belonging. To pass through Oyo's gates was to acknowledge entry into a political community. Masons, in laying these walls, did more than arrange stone. They inscribed the reach of the Oliphanes' authority into the landscape. To outsiders, the walls were intimidating. To insiders, they were protective, reminding all that the empire held firm. Markets, too, reflected this blend of politics and craft. Permanent stalls of stone or packed earth were reserved for traders of higher standing, often guild leaders or those with close ties to the palace. Ordinary sellers managed with temporary shelters, mats, or baskets. Thus, the very layout of a market reflected subtle gradations of rank and privilege, embedded in stone and clay as much as in words. Guilds of masons carried their own authority. Organized by elders, they guarded techniques, supervised apprentices, and ensured that standards were met. Their rituals of initiation included oaths not to betray trade secrets and songs that reinforced solidarity. These guilds were not entirely independent, however. The Olophan or chiefs could summon them for public works, such as repairing walls after a siege or extending palace courtyards. Refusal was rare, for to deny royal command risked not only punishment but spiritual imbalance. Builders, therefore, lived in a delicate position, respected for their craft, needed for their labor, yet always bound to serve higher powers. Women participated in construction as well. Though often in supporting roles, they carried water, fetched stones, mixed mud, and plastered walls. Their contribution was essential, for without steady supplies of water and mortar, masons could not proceed. Women also decorated walls after construction, applying patterns in white chalk or red earth, adding beauty to strength. These decorations carried meaning. Spirals suggested continuity. Interwoven lines suggested unity. Even modest compounds bore such designs, turning daily walls into canvases of belief. Construction extended beyond the earthly into the sacred. Shrines to deities required precise orientation, doors aligned to cardinal points, altars placed at specific corners. Builders collaborated with priests to ensure accuracy. Mistakes could not be tolerated, for a shrine built incorrectly risked offending the deity. These projects, though small in scale, demanded immense care. The mason's chisel thus became a tool not only of craft but of devotion. Even repairs were rituals. When cracks appeared in palace walls, masons patched them with new stone and plaster. But priests accompanied the process with chants, ensuring the repair did not simply mend stone, but restored balance. Thus, maintenance itself became part of the cycle of ritualized construction. If you picture old Oyo in its full splendor, walls rising, compounds expanding, markets buzzing, you see more than a city. You see a living diagram of politics and prayer, traced in stone and earth by the steady hands of masons. Each blow of the hammer, each layer of plaster, was an act of loyalty, a gesture of faith, a marker of belonging. And yet the question lingers: when masons built walls that symbolized authority and sacred order, did they reinforce the power of King's? Did they, in their own quiet way, hold a power just as great, shaping how the empire itself was seen? When we think of decline, we often imagine sudden collapse, a city consumed by flames, an empire toppled in a single night. Old Oyo did not end so abruptly. Its decline was slow, drawn out across decades, like mortar crumbling between stones. Yet, for the masons, even decline left work to be done. By the late 17th and early 18th centuries, Oyo had grown vast. It commanded tribute from neighboring kingdoms, stretching its influence across savanna and forest. But with size came strain. Maintaining long walls, large markets, and expanding palaces required labor that never ceased. Masons were still called upon, patching old walls even as new sections were demanded. The city swelled, but its foundations, political and physical, began to show cracks. The pressures came from many sides. Rival chiefs contested the Alafin's power, weakening central control. Long trade routes strained under raids and disruptions. To the north, Fulani horsemen pressed southward. To the south, coastal trade reshaped alliances. Each disruption left its mark in the city's architecture. Walls once proudly maintained began to crumble at their edges. Repairs were hurried, plaster uneven, bricks mismatched. The very stones began to tell a story of decline, their surfaces marked by haste. For masons, this was a paradoxical era. On one hand, decline meant more work, crumbling structures needed repair, neglected compounds needed reinforcement. On the other, the resources to pay them dwindled. Chiefs, who once commissioned elaborate compounds, cut corners, hiring fewer hands, using inferior clay. The prestige of the Masons' Guild suffered. Where once builders were honored for raising monumental works, they now became repairers of neglect, patching decay rather than shaping grandeur. Still, some projects carried meaning even in decline. Shrines continued to be maintained with care, for to let a shrine crumble was to risk angering the spirits. Masons, therefore, remained essential in ritual life, even as political life grew unstable. In some cases, as chiefs quarreled and armies marched, masons were summoned not to build but to dismantle, to break down walls of rebellious compounds, to strip stones from defeated enemies' courtyards. Thus, the craft of building also became a tool of political punishment. As instability deepened, families and communities began to abandon old Oyo. They carried with them what they could: livestock, tools, woven cloth, even the memory of the mason's work. The city itself, however, could not be carried. Stones remained where they had been laid, silent witnesses to departure. Over time, weeds crept over foundations, walls collapsed into heaps, and courtyards filled with dust. For the masons who stayed until the end, the experience must have been haunting. Imagine standing before a wall you once built, its plaster peeling, its stones shifted by years of rain. You know the weight of each stone. You remember the sweat of carrying it, and yet you cannot halt its collapse. To repair it would be to resist the tide of history itself. Some tried, others turned away. The sound of hammer and chisel grew fainter. Yet stones endure in ways empires do not. Even after Old Oyo was abandoned in the early 19th century, the remnants of its walls and compounds remained visible. Travelers passing through spoke of ruins stretching across the plain, evidence of a city that once thrived. These ruins carried whispers of the mason's labor, their silent craft outlasting the politics that once commanded it. Archaeologists, who later studied the site, found not grand palaces still intact, but fragments, foundations, broken walls, shards of plaster. And yet in these fragments lies testimony. The sheer scale of stonework, even in ruin, speaks to the ambition of those who built. The mason's hands, though forgotten by name, left impressions that weather could not erase. Today, when descendants of the Yoruba recount the story of Old Oyo, they remember kings, wars, and traders. But within the earth lie quieter traces, stones arranged by human hands, set with purpose, enduring in silence. Each stone is both ordinary and monumental, as boring as a block of granite, as profound as a reminder of lives once lived around it. If you close your eyes, you might still hear the echo, the dull thud of mallets, the scrape of chisel against stone, the chant of builders at work. Those sounds have long ceased, but the structures they left ruined, though they are continue to shape memory. And perhaps this is the enduring question. When empires fall and names fade, is it the rulers who are remembered or the silent builders, whose stones remain, outlasting even memory itself? Story 5. The quiet flow of trade, cowries, salt, and the rhythm of exchange. Few were to walk into a Yoruba market in the 17th or 18th century. You would not hear the clink of coins. Instead, you would hear the softer sound of shells caries being poured from gourds, measured into piles, or strung together with twine. To outsiders, they might have seemed trivial, mere shells washed up on distant beaches. Yet for centuries, cowries functioned as one of the most stable and recognizable currencies across West Africa. The cowrie is a small marine shell, smooth oval, with a slit-like opening on one side. It is found naturally in the Indian Ocean, far from Yoruba lands. Traders brought them across the Sahara, and later, via the Atlantic coast, introducing them into the economies of West Africa. At first, their arrival must have seemed strange. Why should shells, carried from so far away, hold value? And yet, once accepted, they transformed markets. In Yoruba markets, cowries were everywhere. A woman selling peppers might count them into small heaps, 40 shells for a handful. A cloth seller might demand a string of 100 shells for a strip of woven cotton. More valuable transactions, purchasing livestock, for example, required baskets full of shells, sometimes thousands at a time. Wealth was measured not only in cattle or wives, but in how many gourds of cowries a household possessed. What made cowries so effective as currency? Part of the answer lies in their durability. Unlike metal, which could rust, or cloth, which could rot, shells endured. They were small enough to transport, yet abundant enough to circulate widely. Their foreign origin also gave them a mystique. They were not tied to any single town's production, and so they carried the aura of something beyond ordinary reach, a gift from distant seas. But cowries were not the only medium of exchange. Salt, for example, carried immense value. Blocks of rock salt, carved from mines far to the north, traveled on caravans southward. In Yoruba towns, salt was prized for preserving food, flavoring dishes, and performing rituals. A trader arriving with salt could command high prices, often trading a block for livestock or bundles of cloth. Salt was heavy, though, and less convenient than cowries for small transactions. It became the currency of larger, more serious trade. While cowries handled daily exchanges, the rhythms of exchange were slow and deliberate. In markets, buyers and sellers often spent long minutes bargaining, not only over prices, but over the exact quality of goods. A calabash of palm oil might look full, but was the oil fresh or rancid? A length of cloth might shine with indigo dye, but was the weave? Cowries changed hands only after careful inspection and back-and-forth conversation. Trade was as much about performance and relationship as about goods. Markets themselves were highly organized. Each town typically had a central marketplace, often open air, where different guilds or associations controlled sections. Salt sellers gathered in one corner, fishmongers in another, cloth weavers along the edge. The soundscape was steady rather than chaotic. Haggling voices, the shuffle of feet on dust, the clatter of cowries poured into bowls. Drummers sometimes played in the background, signaling the market's rhythm. For the olefin and chief's trade was more than economic, it was political. Control of markets meant control of wealth, and taxes on goods provided steady revenue. Collectors walked the stalls, counting baskets, recording bundles, taking their portion in cowries or salt. These revenues funded palaces, armies, and festivals, weaving the economy of shells directly into the fabric of power. Yet, even as cowries flowed through markets, they carried contradictions. They were abundant enough to serve as money, yet their value could fluctuate wildly. A flood of new imports from the coast could suddenly make them less valuable, frustrating sellers. At other times, shortages drove their worth up, causing hoarding. People learned to adapt, mixing cowries with barter. A goat for 3 cloths, a basket of yams for a calabash of oil. Money was never the only language of exchange, just one thread in a web of relationships. Behind these exchanges lay deeper questions. Did cowries truly belong to the Yoruba once they became currency? Or did their foreign origin always whisper of dependency on distant seas? Were markets simply places of trade? Or were they quiet stages where shells, salt, and survival all spoke at once? To understand Yoruba trade, you must imagine a market not as a static place, but as a living rhythm. Markets pulsed according to a 4-day cycle, the sacred order of Yoruba time. Each major town had its designated market day, staggered to allow people from neighboring towns to circulate between them. Thus, trade was not only economic, but stitching communities together through predictable intervals. Picture a cycle. One day in Oyo's central market, another in a nearby village, a third in a different town. Traders planned their routes carefully, moving in loops that matched this rhythm. Farmers left their fields at dawn, carrying yams or vegetables to market, while salt merchants timed their caravans to coincide with the busiest days. This cyclical flow created a shared tempo across the region, a heartbeat of commerce. The market itself was not only a site of goods, but of social life. Families met, news spread, marriages were arranged, disputes settled. Sitting under awnings of palm leaves or woven mats, traders passed slow hours watching customers trickle by. Women were the backbone of these exchanges. Though men might dominate long-distance caravans, it was women who filled stalls, measured out peppers, sold palm oil, and spun cloth. In Yoruba towns, women's trading associations were powerful institutions, regulating prices, protecting members, and lobbying chiefs when unfair taxes were imposed. The details of trade were painstaking. Cowries were often counted into standard heaps 40 shells to a heap, known as uo ijanand. Larger transactions required hundreds or thousands. To ease the counting, shells were sometimes strung into rows of 40, then tied together into bundles. Still, much of the work remained manual. A trader might spend half an hour counting payment, shells slipping between fingers as the pile grew. To the outsider, this might appear tedious, but to participants, the ritual of counting was part of the trust. A hurried exchange suggested deception. A slow one affirmed honesty. Other goods moved alongside cowries. Iron tools, forged by smiths, were highly valued. A single hoe or knife might cost many strings of shells, for without them farming faltered. Cloth, especially indigo-dyed aso oak, commanded prestige, functioning both as currency and as display of wealth. Even food carried symbolic weight. Kola nuts, traded from forest regions, were not only chewed for stimulation, but also offered in rituals and ceremonies. Salt, heavy and precious, was brought on pack animals, wrapped in leaves, its sharp taste prized in a land where preservation mattered. The spatial order of the market reflected social patterns. Certain spots were considered more auspicious. Stalls near entrances attracted higher traffic, while corners near shrines were reserved for ritual specialists. Chiefs appointed officials to oversee disputes, ensuring fairness and maintaining peace. Drums sometimes sounded announcements, warnings of thieves, proclamations of taxes, or news from distant caravans. The market, therefore, was not merely economic, but administrative, functioning as a center of governance. Children grew up within this atmosphere of exchange. A child might carry a basket of peppers for her mother, or run errands between stalls, learning the value of shells before learning to write numbers. Markets were schools of arithmetic and negotiation, training grounds for patience and persuasion. Stories told in Yoruba households often involved clever traders outsmarting rivals, embedding lessons about vigilance and wit. And yet, for all their bustle, markets were not frantic. The pace was slow, almost meditative. A buyer might sit for an hour, inspecting yams, tasting palm wine, or conversing with sellers before making a purchase. Trade unfolded in drawn-out conversations full of proverbs and metaphors. To refuse a price outright was considered rude. To negotiate with gentle phrases, "This cloth is good, but my purse is thin," was the proper way. The process of buying and selling became a performance of manners as much as of value. The market, also, served as a stage of resilience. In years of famine, stalls grew bare, yet people gathered anyway, hoping for whatever little could be spared. In years of abundance, stalls overflowed, shells clattered in endless streams. Through both, the market endured, a steady anchor in the uncertainty of seasons. If you were to sit in such a market, listening to the hum of voices and the clink of shells, you might begin to sense its deeper meaning. It was not only about trade, it was about belonging, rhythm, and survival. But as shells and goods changed hands in slow measure, a question lingered. Did these daily exchanges merely sustain communities, or did they quietly reshape the entire structure of Yoruba society, making markets as important as kings? By the 17th century, the Yoruba world was no longer shaped only by inland rhythms of salt, cloth, and yams. Across the Atlantic, new forces churned, and their ripples reached even the slowest markets. The cowries that once arrived through long Saharan routes began to come in larger floods from the sea. European ships, trading along the bights of Benin and Biafra, brought shells in staggering quantities, scooped from the Indian Ocean and poured onto African coasts. What had once been a scarce, prestigious medium of exchange began to accumulate in baskets and barrels. At first, this abundance seemed a blessing. Traders in Yoruba markets now found shells easier to obtain. Transactions became smoother, wealth more liquid. A farmer who once struggled to gather enough shells for a hoe could now pay in full. But soon, problems emerged. Too many shells meant their value fell. The same basket of peppers that once cost 40 shells might now require 80, then 120. Inflation seeped into the market, slowly, insistently, as foreign traders kept unloading ship after ship of gleaming shells. For women traders who handled daily transactions, this shift was both a burden and a challenge. Counting shells already took time. Now it took twice as long. Gourds grew heavier, string bundles multiplied. More importantly, the sense of stability that cowries once brought began to erode. A savings gourd that seemed secure one season could lose half its purchasing power the next. To cope, families diversified, keeping wealth in livestock, in cloth, in land when possible. Cowries remained central, but trust in them was shaken. Alongside shells came other goods guns, textiles, alcohol exchanged in coastal markets where Yoruba traders mingled with Europeans. Some of these goods filtered inland, reshaping desires and trade patterns. Imported cloth, brightly colored and machine-woven, began to compete with local indigo-dyed fabrics. Iron bars and guns altered the balance of power between chiefs, giving military advantage to those who could secure them. Salt, once carried with difficulty across desert routes, was now supplemented by sea salt from the coast, shifting the monopoly of northern caravans for the olefin and his officials. These changes demanded adaptation. Taxes had to be recalibrated, new trade routes protected, coastal allies negotiated with. The palace, long funded by steady streams of shells and tribute, now faced unpredictability. Sometimes wealth flowed abundantly, at other times shortages caused unrest. The political fabric grew more entangled with coastal currents, making the stability of inland markets dependent on distant oceans. Still, the old rhythms did not vanish. The 4-day cycle of market days persisted. Women continued to arrange peppers in neat heaps, to pour palm oil into calabashes, to measure cloth carefully. Children still learned arithmetic by stringing shells. But beneath the surface of this familiar routine, the ground shifted. Each heap of shells carried the weight of Atlantic trade. Even if the traders in a small town far from the coast never saw a European ship, in some towns, elders worried aloud. Had the cowrie lost its sacred aura? Now that it could be bought in barrels from strangers across the sea, priests still blessed shells in rituals, using them in divination and offerings. Yet, even in the shrines, their ubiquity raised questions. Could an object so common still carry spiritual weight? Or had the world of spirits, like the world of trade, been quietly unsettled by the sea? The story of Yoruba markets, then, is not only about shells, salt, or yams. It is about resilience in the face of shifting tides. Traders adapted, recalibrating, finding new ways to measure worth and sustain communities. The hum of the market endured, but its pitch changed, as distant oceans whispered into every exchange. And so the question remains, when the sea poured its shells into Yoruba markets, did it strengthen them with abundance, or did it, in its quiet overflow, erode the very stability that had made the cowrie a trusted measure of life? Story 6. Gardens, Fountains, and the Silent Work of Ottoman Gardeners Approaching an Ottoman Palace, Mosque, or Madrasa in the 16th or 17th century. Before you reached the doors, before you crossed the courtyards, you might first encounter a garden. These gardens were not wild spaces, nor were they dense forests. Instead, they were arranged carefully rows of cypress and plane trees, beds of tulips and roses, marble fountains trickling in measured streams. To the visitor, they offered calm before ceremony, a threshold between the noise of the city and the solemnity of Ottoman power. But these gardens did not shape themselves. Behind every bed of flowers, behind every flowing fountain, were gardeners' men whose names rarely appear in chronicles, yet whose labor defined the empire's aesthetic. They rose before dawn, carrying buckets, spades, and pruning knives. Their work was unending, for a garden is never finished. Weeds returned, water needed constant redirection. Plants thrived or withered, depending on care. Gardening in the Ottoman world was both art and obligation. The empire valued order, and gardens reflected this ideal. Straight paths, symmetrical beds, carefully trimmed hedges mirrored the empire's claim to control and balance. A neglected garden signaled weakness, while a flourishing one reflected strength. Thus, a gardener's quiet work was also a political act, maintaining appearances of imperial harmony. The daily tasks were slow and methodical. Soil had to be turned, not in haste but evenly, so roots could breathe. Tulip bulbs were planted in autumn, carefully measured to ensure uniform rows when they bloomed. Roses were pruned just so, encouraging blossoms without exhausting the plant. Cypress trees, tall and austere, were trimmed to frame views of domes and minarets, becoming living extensions of architecture. Each action required patience, repetition, and precision. Water was central to this order. Fountains, channels, and pools were more than decorations, they were lifelines. Gardeners monitored the flow constantly, adjusting spouts, clearing debris, and ensuring balance. Too much water and roots rotted. Too little and plants withered. The trickle of water was also symbolic, evoking paradise, as described in the Quran. Gardens beneath which rivers flow. A fountain that ran smoothly was a sign of divine blessing. A fountain clogged with algae or mud hinted at neglect. Gardeners, therefore, served as stewards of both beauty and devotion. Their role extended into ritual. During Ramadan evenings, when lanterns glowed in palace courtyards, gardens became stages for gatherings. Guests strolled among roses, listening to fountains, while musicians played in shaded corners. For such events, gardeners prepared meticulously sweeping paths, refreshing flower beds, polishing marble basins. Their hands, though unseen by the crowd, shaped the setting for imperial hospitality. Yet gardens were not only imperial. In cities like Istanbul, Bursa, and Idorn, mosques and madrases also kept gardens. Students studied under trees, teachers lectured in courtyards, worshippers rested in shaded plots. These gardens required care as well, though often with fewer resources than palaces. Gardeners in these spaces balanced practicality with devotion, ensuring that figs bore fruit, herbs thrived for medicine, and fountains offered refreshment to travelers. Even private homes aspired to gardens, though smaller in scale. Wealthy households maintained inner courtyards where grapevines climbed trellises and jasmine scented the air. Here, too, gardeners or household servants trained in gardening labored quietly, whether large or small, public or private. The principle remained. A garden reflected discipline, prosperity, and care. What strikes the modern eye is how much of this work was invisible in chronicles. Court historians praised sultans for commissioning gardens. Poets sang of tulips and roses. Travelers marveled at fountains. Rarely did they mention the men who weeded, pruned, or carried water. Gardeners were part of the empire's silent machinery, steady but overlooked. And so, if you pause at the gate of an Ottoman garden and listen, you might hear not only the sound of water, but the quiet scrape of a hoe, the rustle of leaves being trimmed, the sigh of a man bending over soil. The beauty of the empire rested on such sounds, yet the question lingers. When we admire Ottoman gardens, are we seeing the vision of sultans and poets or the persistence of gardeners whose silent hands shaped paradise on earth? Once inside the garden walls, the grandeur of tulips and roses might dazzle a visitor. But for the gardener, the eye did not rest on blossoms alone. It lingered on soil texture, the tilt of irrigation channels, the sharpness of a pruning knife. Where guests saw beauty, gardeners saw work. Their mastery lay not in spectacle, but in the repetition of care. The tools they used were simple but indispensable. A hoe for turning earth, a small sickle for cutting grass, long-handled shears for shaping hedges, knives for pruning vines and roses, buckets and pitchers for carrying water from cisterns to beds. Over time, these tools grew worn, their handles smoothed by countless hours of labor. Gardeners often sharpened blades themselves, setting aside part of each week for maintenance. A dull blade meant ragged cuts, which invited disease in plants. In this sense, caring for tools was as crucial as tending the flowers. Watering was a science of its own. Ottoman gardens relied on intricate systems of channels, aqueducts. Gardeners spent hours ensuring that each channel flowed evenly, free of blockages. In summer, Water shortages required rationing. Roses received more, lawns less. Cypress roots were moistened sparingly, while tulips demanded precise amounts. Timing mattered, too. Water poured in the heat of noon evaporated quickly, so gardeners preferred dawn or dusk when the soil drank deeply. To water poorly was to risk both waste and ruin. The gardener's work also included composting. Kitchen scraps, stable manure, and decayed leaves were collected, mixed, and left to rot in heaps. This humus was then spread across beds, enriching soil. Nothing was wasted. The empire's kitchens and stables supplied the fuel for its gardens. The gardener thus linked palace and field, transforming refuse into fertility. Beyond individual skill, gardening in the Ottoman world was organized through guilds. These associations, known as esnaf, united practitioners of the same craft. Gardeners' guilds were less famous than those of weavers or smiths, yet they played a similar role. They regulated apprenticeship, oversaw standards, and protected members' interests. A novice gardener apprenticed under a master for years, learning not only techniques but also ethics, respect for plants, loyalty to patrons, and discretion within palace grounds. Guild rituals often blended labor with devotion. On festival days, gardeners paraded through streets carrying sprigs of cypress or bunches of flowers, announcing their place in the city's economy. They offered prayers at guild lodges, shared meals, and honored deceased members. These gatherings reminded gardeners that they were not solitary laborers, but part of a lineage, bound together by soil and water. Daily rhythms, however, remained the core of their identity. Each season carried distinct tasks. In spring, tulips bloomed, demanding vigilant pruning and careful display. In summer, relentless watering consumed hours, along with the trimming of shade trees. Autumn brought bulb planting and soil preparation. Winter, though quieter, required pruning, repairs to channels, and protection of delicate plants against frost. A year in a garden was like a cycle of prayers, repetitive, predictable, yet essential. The palace gardeners, especially those serving at Topkapi in Istanbul, worked under particular scrutiny. The tulip beds that stretched across its terraces were not merely ornamental. They symbolized imperial taste and refinement. When guests from foreign embassies visited, they walked through these gardens. The quality of their experience reflected on the Sultan himself. For this reason, palace gardeners labored with heightened vigilance. A wilted flower, a dry fountain, a disordered hedge, such details, invisible to most, were unacceptable here. At the same time, mosque and madrasa gardeners sustained quieter but equally vital tasks. They grew herbs for medicine, figs and grapes for food, and maintained shaded courtyards where students could read. Their labor lacked the grandeur of palace tulip festivals, yet it was central to daily life. To water a fig tree so that students might snack in summer, to sweep paths so worshippers could approach with dignity, these were acts of devotion no less than ritual prayers. One could say that the gardener's rhythm mirrored the empire itself, repetitive, deliberate, sustained by countless small acts of maintenance. Just as soldiers guarded borders and scribes copied decrees, gardeners pruned roses and swept paths. Each role was quiet yet essential. Still, a thought lingers. In a world where glory was measured in conquests and monuments, did the empire understand how much its image depended on the quiet persistence of those who bent over soil. By the 18th century, Ottoman gardens had reached their most elaborate form. The tulip, once a wild mountain flower, had become a symbol of refinement. Courtyards gleamed with fountains, marble channels sang with flowing water, and embassies described the Sultan's terraces in lavish terms. Yet within the petals of beauty lay the seeds of decline. The so-called tulip era of the early 1700s made flowers a matter of fashion. Bulbs were traded at high prices, new varieties were cultivated, and entire festivals were staged to display their colors under lantern light. For palace gardeners, this period demanded exquisite attention. Beds had to be replanted frequently, bulbs divided, and displays arranged for night gatherings. But fashions are fleeting. When political unrest and rebellion struck in 1730, the extravagant tulip culture was condemned as excess. Gardens were damaged, fountains neglected, and the work of gardeners suddenly shifted from splendor to survival. Beyond fashion, practical decline set in. As the empire's finances weakened, resources for maintaining elaborate irrigation systems dwindled. Aqueducts cracked, cisterns filled with silt, and fountains lost their sparkle. Gardeners patched what they could, but without steady repair, channels dried. A fountain without water soon became a hollow basin filled with dust or weeds. Marble cracked under heat, moss crept into corners, and vines grew wild where once they were pruned. Yet even in decline, gardeners persisted. They planted hardy shrubs when tulips were too costly. They repaired broken tools rather than replacing them. In smaller mosques and madrasas, figs and herbs still grew, sustaining communities. The empire's grandeur may have waned, but gardeners remained bound to soil. Their labor kept fragments of order alive. By the 19th century, European gardening styles began to influence Ottoman taste. Straight avenues, wide lawns, and imported species entered palace grounds. Some gardeners adapted, learning new methods, while others clung to older rhythms of bulb and cypress. Change was slow but visible. Where once narrow channels curved delicately through flower beds, new pipes of iron carried water in straighter lines. The sound of trickling marble fountains gave way to the hiss of pressurized jets. For the gardener, the tools changed, but the duty remained the same: to water, prune, and sustain. As decades passed, many palace gardens fell into ruin. Travelers noted cracked fountains, untended roses, and lawns overtaken by weeds. Some courtyards, once filled with tulips, stood barren. Yet even in ruins, traces of the gardener's touch remained. A perfectly aligned row of cypress, towering after centuries, spoke of care long forgotten. A hidden aqueduct, still dripping into a mossy trough, revealed the persistence of old waterworks. The garden itself remembered. The quiet resilience of Ottoman gardeners lies not in fame, but in these traces. Few are named in chronicles, and fewer still in monuments. Their biographies are unwritten, yet their work shaped the daily experience of thousands. The cool shade for a scholar reading scripture, the splash of water for a child entering a mosque, the fragrance of roses for a passing guest. Each small act of maintenance carried forward through time today. Visitors to Istanbul can still find remnants of these gardens. At Topkapi Palace, restored beds recall the tulip festivals. In mosque courtyards, ancient plane trees still stretch their branches. Along forgotten aqueducts, wildflowers bloom where gardeners once bent to weed. These fragments remind us that empires are not only remembered in battles or treaties, but in the persistence of soil shaped by patient hands. And so we are left with a final reflection in history's grand sweep, which endures more the conquest of cities, or the quiet act of watering a rose before dawn. Perhaps the gardeners, who never wrote their own chronicles, left behind the more lasting monuments, living and green, long after stone walls crumbled. You have been listening to Boring Past Times. The fountains of the Ottoman gardens may have dried, and the tulips may have withered, but the memory of those who watered, swept, and pruned lingers in the soil. History is not only the noise of battles, but also the quiet persistence of care. May these small details accompany you into rest, like a garden at dusk, where only the sound of leaves remains.